In this video, I'm going to show you how to convert between percents and decimals and fractions. Now, so far this year, we've dealt with decimals and with fractions as ways to describe amounts that are smaller than one or just a part of a whole. A percent is another way to do that. When it comes to the word percent, you can break it up into two words. First of all, there's per and cent. When it comes to the word per, that means out of. And cent is just like dollars and cents. There's 100 cents in a dollar. And just like the word century, there's 100 years in a century. The word cent means 100. So if we're dealing with a percentage like 25%, we can rewrite that as a fraction by doing 25 out of 100. Now we have a fraction, and we know how to simplify a fraction. We could use that ABC button that's on our calculator, or we can look for common factors like 25 is 25 times 1, and 100 is 25 times 4. So then the 25s will cancel, and we'll be left with 1/4. So that is a simplified fraction for 25%. We could also take that same 25% and first of all write it as a fraction, 25 out of 100. And in order to turn that into a decimal, we just divide. So 25 divided by 100. And we'll get 0.25. Let's try a few more examples and see if you can come up with a little pattern here. If we have something like maybe 32%, we can write that as a fraction by putting 32 over 100. You can use that ABC button on your calculator, and you'll get 8 out of 25. Or you can divide and get 0.32 as your decimal. If we have something like 41%, that would be 41 out of 100, which doesn't simplify, so that's our simplified fraction. And if we were to write it as a decimal, it'd be 0.41. Something like 57%. First, turning it into a fraction is 57 out of 100. But when we turn it into a decimal, 0.57. I hope that you're noticing that when we take a percent and turn it into a decimal, it's the same number. 41%, 0.41. 57%, 0.57. So if we want to jump straight from a percent, like 75%, and turn it directly into a decimal, notice that we went from a whole number, like 32.0, and we moved the decimal back 2 places, so that we had 0.32. 41, the decimal went back 2 places. 57, the decimal went back 2 places. So with 75%, we're going to take the decimal point and put it back 2 places. So then we'll end up with a decimal of 0.75. Now be careful for a couple of special cases. First of all, if we have any percentages that have zeros in them, like 30%, we're still going to take the decimal and move it 2 places to the left. So as a decimal, this will be 0.30. But when we write this decimal, we wouldn't include this last 0. We just call it 0.3. If we have zeros on the other side, maybe ones that you don't see, something like 5%, we still need to move the decimal back 2 places. 1, 2. And if we're going to move the decimal back to here, we need to fill it in with another 0. So 0.05. So any single digit percent, like 9%, is not going to be 0.9, but 0.09. And any percentage is bigger than 100%. Maybe we have 150%, and we want to turn that into a decimal. We still only move the decimal point back 2 places. So this, as a decimal, would be 1.5. Something like 231%. The decimal point would be moved back only 2 places, and we would write that as 2.31. overall, the big idea is if we want to take a percent and turn it into a decimal, we move the decimal back 2 places. But what if we want to start with a decimal and turn it back into a percent or turn it into a fraction? Well, thinking about taking a decimal and turning it back into a percent, we just move the decimal point forward 2 places. So if I have something like 0.41 and I want to turn that into a percentage, all I have to do is take the decimal and move it forward 2 places. And that'll become 41%. Now it's easy to turn it into a fraction by just taking that percent and putting it over 100. Let's try a couple more. Say that we have 0.13 and we want to turn that into a percent. Move the decimal forward 2 places. So it'll become 13%. Then writing it as a fraction, 13 over 100. And maybe we have something like 0.85 and we want to turn that into a percent. Move the decimal 2 places so that it'll become 85%. To write it as a fraction, take that 85 divided by 100. And then you could use that ABC button on your calculator if you want to, and you'll get 17 out of 20. Now be careful. Remember, the whole rule about going between decimals and percentages is 2 decimal places. So if we have something like 63%, that's a lot different than 6.3%. Right? And a number like 0.63% is a very, very small percentage. But for all 3 of them, if we're going to convert this into a decimal, we have to take the decimal point from where it is and move it back 2 places. With a traditional percentage like 63%, it's going to be what we expect, 0.63. But be careful when you have special cases. For instance, with 6.3, the decimal point is in the middle. We have to move it back 2 places. If we need extra room, we have to fill that in with 0. So if we're going to put the decimal point right here, I need another 0 before I get to the 6.3. And when the decimal point is already all the way to the left in a percent and I want to turn it into a decimal, I still have to go 2 places, which is going to put the decimal point back here. 0 point, I'll still need 2 more zeros before I get to that 6.3. And going back the other way is just as important. 0.7, 0.07, and 0.007 are all 3 very different percentages. Our whole rule is to move the decimal 2 places. If I'm going to go from these decimals and turn them all into percentages, we're going to move the decimal point now to the right, but still 2 places, 1, 2. And if I need extra space, we got to fill it in with zeros. So this one will end up being 70%. Always move the decimal point back 1, 2 places to the right. Then that'll put the decimal point right after the 7. So 7%. And with a decimal like 0.007, move it back 2 places. That puts a decimal point right in front of the 7. So this is 0.7%. Finally, when it comes to fractions, the first move is to take a fraction and turn it into a decimal. If we want it as a decimal, we leave it as a decimal. If we need it as a percent, then we turn it into a percent from there. So if we have a fraction like a half and we want to turn that into a decimal, you just divide 1 divided by 2. That'll give us 0.5. And then we remember our rule. I have to move the decimal 2 places, 1, 2, out to here. That will mean that this will become 50%. If we have a fraction like 7/10 and we want to turn it into a percent, first thing to do is to turn it into a decimal. Take 7 divided by 10 and we'll get 0.7. Then to turn it into a percentage, move that decimal point 2 places to 70%. Just so you know, you should expect to see a problem that looks like this when it comes to any quiz or test, where we have a table where I give you a percent, a decimal, or a fraction, and you got to fill in the rest. So let's just go through this example together. If we have a percent, like 6%, and we want to turn that into a decimal or into a fraction, figure out where the decimal point is and move it backwards 2 places. If we have any extra spaces like this, we have to fill it in with 0. So we'll have 0.06, and that's our decimal. Don't put the percent there or anything. It's a decimal now. And of course, if we wanted to turn that 6% into a fraction, we just take the 6, put it over 100, and if we have to, simplify. So that would be 3 out of 50. You can use your ABC button for that. When it comes to a decimal, maybe turn that back into a percentage first. So identify where the percent or where the decimal point is and move it 2 places to the right. So this will become 90%. And then turn the percent into a fraction. So 90% would be 90 out of 100. And if we simplify that fraction, it'll simplify to 9 out of 10. Finally, if we are given a fraction and we want to turn that into a decimal and a percent, in order to turn it into a decimal first, you just take 7 divided by 20 and you'll get 0.35. Once it's a decimal, now we move that decimal point 2 places to the right and it becomes a percent.